He is the man who holds two of the strangest records in American history. He delivered the longest and arguably the most punishing inaugural address ever given. And he served the shortest, most tragic, and most constitutionally chaotic presidency. We all know the punchline. William Henry Harrison, the 68-year-old war hero, stood in a freezing storm, hatless and coatless, for 1 hour and 45 minutes, delivering an 8,445-word speech only to catch a cold, develop pneumonia, and die 31 days later. It's a story we tell as a grimly comic warning against pride. But that story, the one we all know, is a lie. It's a myth, a piece of political folklore that obscures a much stranger, darker, and more disgusting truth. Just as the story of his death is a fabrication, so too was the story of his life. The man who in 1840 was sold to the American people as a humble, hard cider drinking frontiersman, a man of the people born and raised in a simple log cabin, was in fact one of the most elite, blue-blooded aristocrats in the entire country. This is not a story about a humble farmer who became a hero. This is a story about a privileged son of the Revolution who invented the humble farmer. This is a story about the birth of modern politics, the moment when image became more powerful than reality. To understand the 31-day presidency, you must first understand the 68 years that came before it. You have to go back past the slogans, past the battles, past the legend. You have to go back to a world of privilege, power, and slavery, back to the very beginning, back to Berkeley. On February 9th, 1773, William Henry Harrison was born. He was not born in a log cabin. He was born at Berkeley Plantation, one of the grandest, most opulent estates in the colony of Virginia. This was the heart of the Virginia gentry, the tiny, interconnected clique of families who owned vast tracts of land, hundreds of human beings, and, for all intents and purposes, the political destiny of the fledgling continent. To be a Harrison was to be American royalty. His father, Benjamin Harrison V, was a towering figure, both literally and politically. He was a wealthy planter, a boisterous, influential delegate to the Continental Congress, and a close personal friend of men like George Washington. In 3 years, Benjamin would put his name on one of the most dangerous documents in history, the Declaration of Independence. Young William Henry, the last of 7 children, was born a British subject. His entire childhood was framed by the very revolution his father was helping to lead. He was just 3 years old when the Declaration was signed. He was 8 when Benedict Arnold, the infamous traitor, raided the James River. British troops under Arnold's command ransacked Berkeley. They looted the silver, burned the portraits, and carried off 40 of the Harrison family's enslaved people. This was the world that shaped him. It was a world of profound, almost schizophrenic contradictions. He was raised on the high-minded classical ideals of Roman liberty, republican virtue, and the rights of man, all while being surrounded, served, and supported by a system of brutal, chattel slavery. This was the paradox at the heart of the Virginia dynasty, and it was a paradox William Henry Harrison would carry with him for his entire life. He was, by all accounts, a serious, bookish child. He wasn't built for the rough and tumble life of a planter. He was given the education of an aristocrat. He was sent to Hampton-Sydney College in 1787, the same year the Constitution was being drafted. It was a rigorous classical school. He was drilled in Latin, Greek, rhetoric, and logic. He was being groomed for a life of gentlemanly service, a lawyer, a statesman, a doctor. His father, a man of the Enlightenment, was famously skeptical of organized religion. He even pulled young William out of Hampton-Sydney for a time, fearing the school was being influenced by the religious fanaticism of the new Baptist and Methodist movements sweeping the frontier. Benjamin Harrison wanted his son to be a man of reason, not faith. In 1790, at the age of 17, William was sent to Philadelphia. This was the nexus of the new United States. It was the nation's temporary capital, a bustling, sophisticated city of 40,000 people. It was where President George Washington held his court, and it was at the time the epicenter of science and medicine in North America. Harrison was enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania to become a doctor, and his mentor was, once again, one of his father's legendary friends, Dr. Benjamin Rush. Imagine being 17 years old, an apprentice to a living legend. Dr. Benjamin Rush wasn't just a doctor, he was a signer of the Declaration, a social reformer, a philosopher. He was also the nation's most famous and most controversial medical mind. To study under Rush was to be initiated into the brutal, primitive world of 18th century medicine. The guiding theory of the day was that all illness stemmed from excessive excitement in the blood. The cure, therefore, was simple. You had to calm the body down, often by weakening it into submission. As a medical student, William Henry Harrison would have learned the heroic arts. He would have learned how to bleed a patient, opening a vein to drain quarts of tainted blood. He would have learned how to administer blisters using hot plasters to burn the skin, believing it would draw the sickness to the surface. He would have been taught to purge the body with massive, violent doses of calomel, mercury, and jalap, inducing agonizing vomiting and dysentery. This was the cutting edge of science, and Harrison, by all accounts, hated every second of it. He was a squeamish, sensitive young man. The blood, the smells, the screams of the patients, it was all too much. He later confessed to his biographers that he found the profession distasteful. He was living in Philadelphia, lodging with the revolutionary financier Robert Morris. He was writing letters home, complaining about his studies, but dutifully trying to please his powerful father. He was on a path he did not want, in a city he didn't quite fit into, studying a profession he despised. And then, in the spring of 1791, his entire world collapsed. A letter arrived from Berkeley. His father, Benjamin Harrison V, was dead. The death was a profound personal blow, but it was also a financial catastrophe. When the family's accounts were settled, they discovered a shocking truth. The great Benjamin Harrison had died deeply in debt. The family's wealth was a mirage. The land was mortgaged. The fortune was gone. Suddenly, at 18, William Henry Harrison was no longer the son of a Virginia grandee. He was a broke, parentless student stranded in Philadelphia with no money for tuition and no taste for the medicine he was supposed to be studying. The path that had been laid out for him since birth, a quiet, comfortable, aristocratic life, had vanished overnight. He was, for the first time in his life, on his own. He needed a job. He needed a career, and fast. He abandoned his medical studies instantly. For a man of his social class with no inheritance, the options were limited. He couldn't be a planter. He didn't want to be a doctor. He didn't have the patience to study law. That left one time-honored path for a well-connected but penniless young gentleman, the Army. He went to his father's most powerful friend, President George Washington. But Washington was in Virginia. So Harrison found the next best thing, Virginia's governor, Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee, the father of Robert E. Lee. Harrison asked for a commission in the United States Army. Lee wrote the letter. Within 24 hours, William Henry Harrison, the 18-year-old failed medical student, was sworn in as an ensign in the 1st U.S. Infantry. His pay was $3 a week. He was given his orders. He was to report immediately to the most dangerous, God-forsaken place in the new republic. He was being sent to the Northwest Territory. To understand what Harrison was walking into, you have to understand the state of the U.S. Army in 1791. It was not a proud professional force. It was a national joke. It was a tiny, poorly trained, badly supplied collection of street toughs, drunkards, and petty criminals, numbering barely a few hundred men, and it had just suffered the single most devastating defeat in American military history. Just as Harrison was marching west, a general named Arthur St. Clair had led the entire U.S. Army into the Ohio wilderness to punish a confederation of native tribes. On November 4th, 1791, a force of 1,000 warriors led by the Miami Chief Little Turtle and the Shawnee Chief Blue Jacket staged a perfect pre-dawn surprise attack. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. It's known as St. Clair's defeat, or the Battle of the Wabash. In 3 hours, the U.S. Army was annihilated. More than 600 soldiers were killed, along with hundreds of civilian camp followers. It was a 97% casualty rate. Proportionally, it was a slaughter far worse than Custer's last stand. This was the army that Ensign William Henry Harrison joined. It was a terrified, demoralized, and broken force, huddled behind the walls of Fort Washington, a muddy stockade on the banks of the Ohio River that would one day become the city of Cincinnati. The place was a hellhole. The fort was a chaotic mess of drunken soldiers, terrified settlers, prostitutes, and frontier toughs. Harrison's new commander, General James Wilkinson, a man who, we now know, was secretly a paid agent of the Spanish crown, described his new recruits as men who are purchased from the prisons, wheelbarrows, and brothels of the nation. For a refined, classically educated Virginia aristocrat, this was a profound culture shock. His fellow officers, many of them hard-drinking and barely literate, resented him immediately. They saw his soft hands, his classical education, and his aristocratic bearing, and they mocked him. They called him a boy and took bets on how long he would last before the whiskey, the disease, or a Shawnee warrior finished him off. Harrison did something no one expected. He dug in. He used the one trait his father had drilled into him, a rigid, almost fanatical self-discipline. While the other officers caroused and drank themselves into a stupor, Harrison lived Spartanly. He meticulously drilled his men. He read military history by candlelight. He refused to drink, earning the respect of the few sober officers. Most importantly, he caught the eye of the new man President Washington had sent to fix this mess, a man who was the literal opposite of the bumbling St. Clair. His name was General Mad Anthony Wayne. Mad Anthony Wayne was a Revolutionary War legend. He was famously aggressive, obsessively disciplined, and utterly relentless. He had no patience for failure. He arrived in the West with a new presidentially authorized army, the Legion of the United States, and he began literally to beat it into shape. Wayne drilled his men mercilessly. He built forts. He hacked roads through the dense black forest of Ohio. He trained his men to load their muskets while running, to fight with bayonets, and to never ever be surprised. And he saw something in this serious, sober, 20-year-old Ensign Harrison. He saw a man who didn't drink, who followed orders, and who could write. In 1793, Wayne promoted Harrison and made him his aide-de-camp. For the next year, Harrison was Wayne's right-hand man. He was the pen to Wayne's sword. He sat in on every strategy session. He wrote Wayne's dispatches. He learned firsthand how to build an army, how to manage a supply line, and how to wage a total war of attrition, not just fighting warriors, but burning their villages, their cornfields, their entire means of survival. He was also learning about his enemy. He was learning the names Miami, Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandotte, Potawatomi. He was learning how this confederacy led by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket had brilliantly used the forest to outmaneuver and destroy a superior American force. He was learning the lesson that would define his life. To win this land, you had to be as ruthless as the frontier itself. In the summer of 1794, Wayne's Legion was ready. They marched deep into the heart of the native Confederacy, along the Maumee River. The tribes, now led by Blue Jacket, Little Turtle sensing defeat, had advised peace, prepared an ambush. They chose a location where a recent tornado had ripped a path through the forest, scattering hundreds of massive trees. It was a perfect defensive maze of tangled wood. They called it Fallen Timbers. On August 20th, 1794, Wayne's Legion advanced. The native warriors, hidden among the logs, opened fire. Wayne's men, just as they had been drilled, did not panic. Wayne ordered a full frontal bayonet charge. The legionnaires, screaming, charged into the labyrinth. The warriors, who were used to fighting a hit-and-run style, were not prepared for the shock of a disciplined cold steel charge. They couldn't reload their muskets fast enough. The battle, which had been building for 3 years, was over in less than an hour. The Confederacy was shattered. William Henry Harrison was in the thick of it. He rode alongside Wayne, dodging bullets, relaying orders. Wayne, in his official report, praised his young aide for his conspicuous and gallant bravery. The Battle of Fallen Timbers was a total American victory. It broke the back of native resistance in Ohio. A year later, in 1795, the defeated tribes gathered at Fort Greenville. They signed the Treaty of Greenville, ceding almost all of modern-day Ohio to the United States. William Henry Harrison, now a 22-year-old captain, was a signatory on that treaty. He stood and watched as the great chiefs, Little Turtle, Blue Jacket, made their marks, surrendering the land of their ancestors. It was a lesson he would never forget. He had seen how a combination of overwhelming military force and political treaty-making could clear a continent. He had found his calling. The Army had saved Harrison. It had given him a purpose, a salary, and a reputation for bravery. It also introduced him to the two great loves of his life. The first was Anna Tuthill Sims. In 1795, while on assignment near North Bend, Ohio, Captain Harrison met Anna. She was the 20-year-old daughter of Judge John Cleves Sims. And if Harrison was a Virginia aristocrat, Sims was a frontier baron. The judge was one of the most powerful and ruthless land speculators in the entire Northwest Territory, owning a patent for hundreds of thousands of acres between the Miami rivers. Harrison, the dashing 22-year-old war hero, was instantly smitten. Anna, educated and intelligent, fell for him too. There was one problem: her father. Judge Sims saw Harrison as a penniless soldier. He was a Virginian, which was bad enough, but he was a military man. Sims, a land dealer, saw soldiers as transient, unstable, and most importantly, poor. He wanted a lawyer or a land baron for his daughter. He flatly forbade the marriage. On November the 25th, 1795, while the judge was away on business, William Henry Harrison and Anna Sims eloped. They were married in secret at the home of one of Sims's business partners. When the judge returned, he was furious. He summoned the young captain. The confrontation is a frontier legend. "Well, sir," the judge boomed, "how do you intend to support my daughter?" Harrison, 22 years old and brimming with the confidence of a man who had survived fallen timbers, supposedly drew himself up, placed his hand on the hilt of his officer's sword, and replied, "By my sword and my own right arm, sir." The judge, perhaps seeing a reflection of his own iron will, had no choice but to accept the marriage. It would be a long and genuine partnership lasting 45 years, but it was also a brilliant career move. Harrison had just married into the most powerful and richest land speculating family on the frontier. The second love he found was land itself. not to farm it, but to trade it. In 1798, Harrison, now 25, decided his future was not in the military. The glory was over. The fighting had stopped. The real power, he now understood, was in politics. It was the politicians who decided who got what land. He resigned his commission, and, pulling strings with his new father-in-law and his old Virginia connections, he got himself appointed by President John Adams as the Secretary of the Northwest Territory. This was the number 2 job, the assistant to the governor, Arthur St. Clair, the same general who had been defeated at the Wabash. Harrison was a natural. He was smart, disciplined, and ambitious, and he was now perfectly positioned to start building his own fortune. He began buying up vast tracts of land, often at rock-bottom prices, anticipating where the new waves of settlers would go. A year later, in 1799, the territory was large enough to send a non-voting delegate to Congress in Philadelphia. Harrison ran for the post. His opponent was Arthur St. Clair, Jr., the governor's son. It was a race that pitted the old guard, St. Clair, against the new man, Harrison. Harrison campaigned as a friend of the common settler, a man who understood the frontier. He won by a single vote. At 26 years old, William Henry Harrison returned to Philadelphia. The last time he was here, he was a broke, grieving 18-year-old medical student. Now, he was a war hero, a husband, a landowner, and a congressman. He arrived in Congress with one singular mission: to make land cheaper and easier to buy. He became the chairman of the Committee on Public Lands, and in 1800 he authored the bill that would become his first great political legacy, the Harrison Land Act of 1800. On the surface, it was a populist masterpiece. The old law required settlers to buy a minimum of 640 acres at $2 an acre. This was far too expensive for the average farmer. Harrison's new law split the tracts, allowing a man to buy as few as 320 acres. More importantly, it established a credit system. A settler only had to pay 50 cents an acre down and could pay the rest off over 4 years. This law unleashed a tidal wave of migration into the West. It was exactly what the common settler wanted, but it was also exactly what the wealthy land speculator wanted: men just like William Henry Harrison. The law created a land boom. It allowed speculators to buy up vast territories with a tiny down payment, hold the land as prices soared, and then sell it for a massive profit. Harrison, the author of the bill, was one of its greatest beneficiaries, using his inside knowledge and new credit rules to expand his own holdings. He had perfectly disguised his own private, speculative interests inside a wildly popular public policy. It was a brilliant piece of political maneuvering, and it made him a star. The West saw him as its champion. The common men of the frontier, the small farmers, the squatters, saw him as their man in Philadelphia. President John Adams saw a man who knew how to get things done. But Adams was on his way out. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson won the presidency. Jefferson, a fellow Virginian, saw in Harrison the perfect agent for his own vision of a westward expanding empire of liberty. In 1801, the Northwest Territory was split. A new, even more remote wilderness was carved out, called the Indiana Territory. It was a vast, ungoverned space populated almost entirely by native tribes. Jefferson needed a man to run it. He needed a man who was part soldier, part diplomat, and part bureaucrat. He needed someone who knew the frontier, who understood the tribes, and who had a proven, ruthless ability to acquire their land. He knew exactly the man for the job. On May 13th, 1801, President Jefferson appointed 28-year-old William Henry Harrison as the first governor of the Indiana Territory. He was given near dictatorial powers. He was the commander-in-chief of the militia, the superintendent of Indian affairs, and the sole authority for all land deals. The boy from Berkeley Plantation, The failed doctor, the sober ensign, was now the king of the American frontier. He was about to step out of the shadow of men like Anthony Wayne and into a direct 12-year conflict with one of the greatest leaders in Native American history. The hero of the Ohio was about to become the land jobber of the Wabash, and the decisions he made here would not only spark a new bloody war, they would create the nickname that would, decades later, make him president. The man who arrived in the Indiana Territory in 1801 was a world away from the broke, squeamish medical student who had fled Philadelphia a decade earlier. He was now a 28-year-old governor, invested with near dictatorial powers by President Thomas Jefferson himself. His mission, handed down from the new president, was singular and relentless: get the land. This wasn't just a governorship, it was a proconsulship of an empire. The territory was a colossal, untamed wilderness, and William Henry Harrison was its absolute ruler. This 12-year reign would not just be a political appointment, it would be the forging of a legend, a brutal masterclass in expansion, and the beginning of a long personal duel with one of the greatest leaders in American history. Harrison's new capital was the village of Vincennes. To call it a capital was a generous term. It was a muddy, chaotic, primitive outpost on the banks of the Wabash River. It was a rough collection of a few hundred souls: French-Canadian fur traders, a handful of American squatters, transient soldiers, and a constant flow of Native American traders who often staggered drunkenly through the unpaved streets. This was Harrison's kingdom, and his power here was almost total. As governor, he was not just an executive. He was, initially, the entire legislative branch picking his own counsel. He was the commander-in-chief of the territorial militia. He was the commissioner of public lands, and most critically, he held the title of superintendent of Indian affairs. This title meant that he, and he alone, had the legal authority to negotiate with the tribes. He was the sole gatekeeper for every land deal. He had the full power of the United States government in one hand and a bag of federal gold in the other. His first act in Vincennes was a statement. This Virginia aristocrat was not going to live like a frontiersman. He was not going to live in a log cabin. On a hill overlooking the Wabash, he began construction of his new home. He named it Grouseland. It was a magnificent 2-story brick federal-style mansion. It was a piece of Berkeley plantation, a slice of Philadelphia, dropped into the middle of the wilderness. It was the first brick building in the entire territory. Grouseland was a fortress and a palace. Its windows were designed as rifle ports. Its walls were thick, its cellars full of fine wines. It was a home for his wife Anna and their growing family. But more than that, it was a political tool. It was designed to awe the rough-handed American settlers who came to petition him and to intimidate the tribal chiefs who were summoned there to negotiate. It was a physical manifestation of his power and his unshakable belief in the civilization he was bringing to the savage frontier. His mission came directly from his boss, President Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson's instructions in his private letters to Harrison reveal the cold, calculated philosophy behind American expansion. Jefferson didn't want a bloody, expensive war of conquest. That was messy. He wanted the appearance of legality. He outlined a 2-pronged attack. First, Harrison was to push the native tribes to abandon their hunter lifestyle and become farmers. On the surface, this sounded benevolent, but it was a trap. Farmers, Jefferson argued, would find that they have more land than they can cultivate. This would, in his words, dispose them to alienate their surplus land for cheap. The second prong was debt. Harrison was to encourage the government-run trading posts to Be liberal in letting them get into debt. A tribe that owed the trading post money had only one way to pay it back, by selling land. Jefferson wrote, "We shall thus be going on step by step, and shall be able to drive them with their own consent across the Mississippi." This was Harrison's playbook. He was to act as a land broker, a debt collector, and, if necessary, a warlord. And he began his work with a ruthless, methodical efficiency. For the next decade, Harrison's primary job was extinguishing Indian title. He did this by signing 13 major treaties. In total, he would acquire more than 60 million acres of land. He was not a simple bully. He was a master of political psychology. He developed a devastatingly effective method for separating the tribes from their ancestral land. First, divide and conquer. Harrison never, ever negotiated with the tribes as a single confederacy. He knew from his time at Fallen Timbers that their only strength was in unity. So he targeted them one by one, picking at old rivalries. He'd approach the Delaware and then use their deal to put pressure on the Miami. He'd use the Potawatomi to sell land that the we also claimed. He kept them weak, suspicious of each other, and competing for his favor. Second, find the annuity chiefs. He identified which tribal leaders were, to put it bluntly, for sale. After the Treaty of Greenville, the government had begun paying annuities, yearly cash payments, to peaceful chiefs. Harrison learned to find the men who had become dependent on this cash, or on the status it gave them. He would then offer them huge personal bribes, side deals, and larger annuities, in exchange for their mark on a treaty. A perfect example was the great Miami chief Little Turtle. After his defeat at Fallen Timbers, Little Turtle had become a realist. He believed resistance was futile. He adopted white customs, even visiting President Washington in Philadelphia. Harrison lavished Little Turtle with praise, built him a house, and gave him a generous private stipend. In return, Little Turtle became Harrison's peace chief. His prize used to give the appearance of consent to his treaties, even as other chiefs protested. Third, and most notoriously, use alcohol. This was the secret weapon that was whispered about all over the frontier. It was, in fact, illegal to bring large quantities of whiskey into Indian territory. But Harrison, as superintendent, was the one who enforced that law. Treaty negotiations at Vincennes or Fort Wayne were often just week-long drunken debaucheries. Harrison would provide hospitality, which meant wagons full of whiskey. He would wait until the chiefs and warriors were hopelessly intoxicated, their judgment gone, their resistance weakened, and then he would present the treaty. One frontier observer, William Wells, wrote that Harrison's agents made the Indians drunk and got them to sign a treaty for their land. It was a policy of deliberate, systematic chemical warfare designed to destroy the social cohesion and the political will of the tribes. And finally, the threat of force. Harrison was always, at heart, a general. During every negotiation, he would make sure his militia was drilling nearby. He would stage parades, fire cannons. The message was always clear: this is the pen, but the sword is right behind it. Using this method, he began to dismember the territory. The Treaty of Vincennes in 1803, a treaty with the Delaware in 1804, a treaty with the Piankashaw. Piece by piece, in million-acre chunks, the map was being redrawn. The tribes were being pushed into smaller and smaller corners, surrounded by a relentless tide of white settlement. And Harrison, personally, was profiting. As governor and land commissioner, he had first access. He continued his private land speculation, buying up prime real estate that he knew would soon be open for settlement. He was, in effect, the ultimate insider trader. While Governor Harrison was building his public empire, he was also managing his private one. And it is here, in the shadows of his grand mansion, that the deepest, most troubling contradictions of his life emerge. First, there was the issue of slavery. William Henry Harrison was a Virginia aristocrat to his bones. He had been raised by and believed in the institution of slavery. But the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the founding charter of his territory, had explicitly banned slavery. To Harrison, this was not a moral triumph. It was an economic disadvantage. He believed that this ban was scaring away the right kind of settlers, wealthy planters from Virginia and Kentucky who would only move if they could bring their enslaved workforce with them. The common anti-slavery farmers from Ohio or Pennsylvania, he felt, were of a lower class. So William Henry Harrison, governor of a free territory, began a 10-year political campaign to introduce slavery into Indiana. In 1802, he convened a hand-picked convention at Vincennes. He was the chairman, and he controlled the proceedings. The convention passed a resolution, written by Harrison, petitioning Congress to suspend the anti-slavery clause of the ordinance for 10 years. He argued it was the unanimous desire of the people. It was a lie. A fiery anti-slavery opposition, led by men like Territorial Delegate James Menominee, organized their own petitions. Congress, caught in a crossfire, ultimately refused Harrison's request. Undeterred, Harrison and his aristocratic legislature passed a series of black laws that bypassed Congress entirely. They passed a 1805 law on indentured servitude, which allowed slaveholders to bring their enslaved people into Indiana, forced them to sign a contract of indenture, often for 99 years, and then enforce that contract with whips, chains, and slave-catching patrols. It was slavery in all but name. This campaign reveals the true William Henry Harrison. He was not the common man's hero. He was the champion of the wealthy planter class. He was a man who, when faced with a moral and legal barrier, used his power to find a cynical, legalistic workaround. And it's in this context, in a free town where he was fighting to make slavery legal, in a mansion that was likely staffed by these so-called indentured servants, that we find the most explosive and most hidden secret of his life. This is the story of Dilcia. It is not a story you will find in his official heroic biographies. It is a story that was passed down carefully and painfully through the generations of a black family. It was first made public by Walter Francis White, the famous civil rights leader and president of the NAACP in the 20th century. According to White's family history, William Henry Harrison, while governor in Vincennes, began a long-term sexual relationship with an enslaved woman named Dilcia. Dilcia, the story goes, was owned by a neighboring planter. Harrison, it is alleged, fathered 6 children with her. This was, of course, the great open secret of the plantation South. It was the world of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. It was the ultimate corrupting power of the slave master. The allegation continues that as Harrison's national profile began to rise, the existence of this second mixed-race family became a profound political liability. Sometime before his 1840 campaign, the story alleges, Harrison transferred or sold 4 of these children, his own children, to his brother, Benjamin Harrison VI, who owned a plantation in Alabama. They were taken south to be raised as slaves to get them out of Ohio and away from the prying eyes of the press. Is this story true? It is, like the Hemings story for so long, impossible to prove with the kind of documents a historian would demand. It is a family's oral history, a private truth standing against a public silence. But it fits perfectly and tragically with the man we now see, the man who saw the law as a tool to be bent, The man who in his public life was fighting to protect the very system of chattel slavery that would allow a powerful white man to own, control, and dispose of not just his mistress, but his own children. This was the man at Grouseland. Publicly, the upright, disciplined governor, the devoted husband to Anna. Privately, a pro-slavery ideologue and allegedly the master of a shadow family. And all of this, the land grabbing, the slavery, the hypocrisy, was about to produce a violent and spiritual backlash. Harrison's policies were not just a political disaster for the tribes, then they were a social and spiritual apocalypse. The relentless loss of land destroyed their hunting grounds. The flood of cheap whiskey, deliberately provided by men like Harrison, tore their communities apart. Alcoholism, disease, and despair were rampant. The old chiefs, the annuity chiefs like Little Turtle, seemed weak, broken, and bought. The people were leaderless, and their gods seemed to have abandoned them. Into this vacuum of power and faith, two brothers emerged. They were Shawnee. They had been at Fallen Timbers. They had seen the great defeat. One was a brilliant, charismatic, and powerful warrior named Tecumseh. The other was not. The other brother was named Lalawethika. He was, by all accounts, a total failure. He was clumsy. He had lost his right eye in a childhood accident. He was a terrible hunter. He was a loud-mouthed, belligerent, and mean-spirited drunkard. He was a failed medicine man, a laughingstock among his own people. In the spring of 1805, Lalawethika, in the depths of his alcoholic despair, collapsed. He fell into a fire, and his family, thinking him dead, prepared his funeral. And then he woke up. He claimed he had been taken to the spirit world, to the Master of Life. He had been shown a paradise for those who followed the old ways, and a fiery hell for those who adopted the white man's vices. He saw the souls of drunks with molten lead pouring down their throats. He was transformed. He swore off alcohol. He began to preach. He changed his name to Tenskwatawa, the open door. We know him as the prophet. The prophet's message was a spiritual revolution. It was simple and it was electrifying. He told the people that the Master of Life had sent him to save them. The white men were children of the evil spirit. He demanded a total cultural purification. They must reject everything white, reject the iron plows, reject the wool blankets, reject the private property, reject the chiefs who signed away the land, and above all, reject the white man's most deadly poison, whiskey. This was not just a religious revival, it was a direct political and economic attack on William Henry Harrison's entire system. The prophet's message rendered Harrison's greatest weapon, alcohol, useless. It branded Harrison's greatest allies, the annuity chiefs, as traitors and witches. The prophet's movement became a witch hunt. His followers began to seek out and execute friendly chiefs, accusing them of magic. They burned them alive. This was a brutal political purge, eliminating Harrison's network of informants and collaborators. Governor Harrison, from his mansion in Vincennes, watched this new movement with contempt and alarm. He saw the prophet as a charlatan, a pretender, and a stupid, one-eyed demagogue. In 1806, Harrison sent a letter to the tribes, a letter dripping with condescension. He wrote, "Who is this prophet who dares to speak for the Great Spirit? Demand of him a miracle. Ask him to cause the sun to stand still, or the moon to alter its course." It was the single greatest mistake of Harrison's career. The prophet, who had likely been told by white traders about an upcoming solar eclipse, announced that on June 16, 1806, he would blot out the sun. On that day, as a crowd of skeptics watched, a total solar eclipse plunged the frontier into midday darkness. The prophet stood in the terrifying twilight, raised his arms, and commanded the sun to return. As the shadow passed, he was no longer a charlatan. He was a god. His power was now absolute, and his movement, which had once been spiritual, now turned political. In 1808, the prophet and his brother, the brilliant strategist Tecumseh, moved their followers. They founded a new grand capital, a city of God, at the confluence of the Wabash and Tippecanoe rivers. They called it Prophet's Town, and it was a loaded gun pointed directly at the heart of Harrison's territory. Now the true leader of the movement stepped out of his brother's shadow. Tecumseh was everything the prophet was not. He was a tall, handsome, athletic warrior. He was a magnetic speaker, a brilliant political thinker, and a military genius. He did not believe in magic. He believed in unity. While the prophet was the spiritual heart, Tecumseh was the political brain. He took his brother's religious message and forged it into a powerful political and military confederacy. Tecumseh's philosophy was a direct legal and moral challenge to Harrison's entire life's work. His argument was simple and devastating. No tribe has the right to sell the land even to each other, much less to strangers. Sell a country. Why not sell the air, the clouds, and the great sea? The Great Spirit gave this great island to his red children. He did not put the white people on this island. This was Harrison's nightmare. Tecumseh was doing what the tribes had failed to do at Fallen Timbers. He was uniting them. He was traveling from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, preaching that the land belonged to all tribes in common. In 1809, Harrison knew he had to act. He had to break Tecumseh's growing power. He decided to execute his most audacious and most fraudulent land grab yet. He called a meeting at Fort Wayne. He did not invite Tecumseh or the prophet, arguing the Shawnee had no claim to the land. Instead, he gathered a collection of pliable annuity chiefs from the Miami, Potawatomi, and Delaware tribes. He plied them, as one observer noted, with the liberal use of liquor, and on September 30th, 1809, he got them to sign the Treaty of Fort Wayne. The deal was a monstrous theft. The chiefs sold 3 million acres of land, a massive swath of the Wabash Valley, for a total of about $7,000, or roughly 1/3 of 1 cent per acre. When Tecumseh returned, he was enraged. This whiskey treaty, he said, was the final, unforgivable straw. The chiefs who signed it were traitors who had sold land they didn't even live on. He decided to confront the land jobber governor himself. In August of 1810, Governor Harrison, standing on the grand porch of Grouseland, looked out to see a flotilla of 80 war canoes, carrying 400 warriors in full war paint, sweeping down the Wabash. Tecumseh, in the lead, had come to Vincennes. This is one of the most cinematic confrontations in American history. Harrison arranged a council on the lawn of his mansion. He surrounded himself with soldiers. Tecumseh refused to sit on the white man's bench, saying he preferred to rest upon the bosom of his mother, the earth. Harrison began with a condescending speech, claiming the U.S. had always been fair and that the Fort Wayne Treaty was legal. Tecumseh stood up, and he gave the speech of his life. He was not a savage. He was a statesman, and he eviscerated Harrison with logic, passion, and fury. He laid out the entire history of Harrison's treaties. "You are a liar," Tecumseh declared, pointing at the governor. "The Great Spirit gave this great island to his red children. This land was sold, and the sale was bad." He called the Treaty of Fort Wayne a cheat. He said the annuity chiefs were impostors. He announced his intention to kill any chief who tried to uphold the treaty. Harrison's aide snapped, "That is a bold and impudent lie." A translator, sensing the rage, told Harrison, "Sir, these Indians are planning to kill you." All 400 warriors, as one, leaped to their feet, grabbing their tomahawks and war clubs. The soldiers surrounding Harrison cocked their rifles. Harrison himself drew his small sword. For one long, terrifying moment on the lawn of Grouseland, the two men, the Virginia aristocrat and the Shawnee statesman, stood just feet apart on the brink of a war. Tecumseh, seeing he was outgunned, held his men back. The council was over, but the lines were drawn. Tecumseh gave Harrison a final warning. He was going south to unite all the tribes, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. He warned Harrison to stay off the new treaty lands. When he returned, he said they would either tear up the treaty or they would fight. In the summer of 1811, Tecumseh made his move. He left Prophetstown and began his epic journey south, leaving his brother, the prophet, in charge. He gave his brother one solemn, critical order: do not fight. No matter what Harrison does, do not be drawn into a battle. The Confederacy was not ready. Harrison in Vincennes saw his chance. His great rival was gone. The U.S. government, hearing of Tecumseh's insolence and seeing the British-made rifles at Prophetstown, was clamoring for action. The Secretary of War gave Harrison his orders: march on Prophetstown and disperse the bandits. This was the moment Harrison had been waiting for. This was his chance to become a true military legend, to step out of mad Anthony Wayne's shadow. He assembled a force of nearly 1,000 men, a corps of U.S. Army regulars, and a larger, rowdier group of Kentucky and Indiana militia, men who hated the Indians and were eager for a fight. He marched his army north, up the Wabash, directly into the heart of the Prophet's territory. It was a tense, nervous march. Every man in that column knew what had happened to St. Clair's army in this same forest. Harrison, to his credit, was a cautious, disciplined commander. He drilled his men relentlessly. He fortified his camp every single night. On November 6, 1811, Harrison's army arrived at the gates of Prophetstown. The prophet was trapped. Tecumseh was gone. The warriors in the town, a mix of Shawnee, Kickapoo, and Potawatomi, were young, hot-headed, and terrified. They looked to their spiritual leader for a miracle. Tenskwatawa, the prophet, had a choice. He could obey his brother and try to sue for peace, or he could be the master of life's chosen one. His ego and the pressure from his warriors made the choice for him. He sent a delegation to Harrison asking for a truce. He said he would meet for a peace council the next day. Harrison, wary of a trick, agreed, but he didn't lower his guard. He marched his men to a high wooded ridge about a mile from the town. It was a strong defensive position, but it was also a provocation. He ordered his men to sleep in a rectangular battle formation, fully clothed, with their bayonets fixed and their rifles in their arms. That night in Prophetstown, Tenskwatawa performed his final desperate magic. He gathered the warriors. He told them that his spells would make them invincible. The white man's bullets would turn to sand. Their powder would be as harmless as ashes. He ordered them to attack the American camp in the pre-dawn darkness. At 4:30 a.m. on November 7th, 1811, the night was cold, black, and drizzling. Harrison's men, exhausted, were in a fitful sleep. A single shot from a sentry rang out, and then the blackness erupted. Hundreds of warriors, screaming, their faces painted, inspired by the prophet's magic, charged the American lines. The Battle of Tippecanoe had begun. It was pure, terrifying chaos. The warriors crashed into the left flank, right where the untrained militia were sleeping. It was St. Clair's defeat all over again. Men were shot and tomahawked in their tents before they were even awake. The militia line buckled, broke, and ran. This was Harrison's moment. This was the test. And William Henry Harrison, the aristocrat, the land jobber, proved he was without question a soldier. He was cool, brave, and utterly fearless. He mounted his gray mare, and instead of riding to the rear, he galloped directly into the heart of the broken line. His aides screamed at him to get down. A bullet ripped through the brim of his hat. Another struck his horse. He was a perfect target, but he stayed mounted, a visible rallying point in the chaos. He bellowed orders, reforming the line, shifting the U.S. regulars to plug the gap. The American troops, thanks to his drilling, did not panic. They held. They formed up shoulder to shoulder and began to pour disciplined, devastating volleys of buck and ball into the charging warriors. As the first gray light of dawn broke, the battle turned. The warriors, who had been promised invincibility, were being cut to pieces. Their magic had failed. The prophet, who was safely on a hill, could only watch in horror. The element of surprise was gone. Now it was a brutal, open firefight. And Harrison, seeing the native attack waver, ordered a counterattack. A full, desperate bayonet charge. That broke them. The warriors, disillusioned and defeated, fled back across the marshy prairie to Prophetstown. The battle was over. It had lasted 2 hours. Harrison's army was shattered, but it held the field. They had suffered staggering losses, 62 killed and 126 wounded. Nearly 1 in 5 of his men was a casualty. The next day, November 8th, Harrison's men marched into the deserted Prophetstown. The prophet and his surviving warriors had fled. They found the town's entire winter food supply, and they found powder and new British-made muskets. This was the proof Harrison needed that the British were backing the tribes. His men ate their fill, and then Harrison gave the order to burn it all. They torched Prophetstown, destroying the city of God, the capital of the Confederacy, and the holy place of the new religion. Harrison, his wounded groaning in wagons, marched his battered army back to Vincennes. He immediately sat down and wrote a dispatch to Washington. It was a masterpiece of political spin. He declared he had won a complete and decisive victory over the whole flower of Tecumseh's Confederacy. He glossed over his heavy losses. He portrayed himself as the proactive, conquering hero who had met the savage threat and destroyed it. The press and the country, desperate for a military hero, bought it completely. The Battle of Tippecanoe became a legend. And William Henry Harrison, the cautious governor, who had been caught in a pre-dawn surprise attack and barely survived, was given a new immortal name, Old Tippecanoe. He had his victory, he had his legend, but he had not solved his problem. When Tecumseh returned from the south, he found his capital in ashes, his warriors scattered, and his brother a discredited fraud. His dream of a peaceful, united Confederacy was dead, burned to the ground by Harrison's troops. His choice was gone. His path was clear. There would be no more negotiations. There would be no more treaties. William Henry Harrison, in winning his nickname, had just triggered the real war. The only ally Tecumseh had left was the British, and the War of 1812 was about to begin. The smoke from Prophetstown's ruins drifted east, carrying with it the seeds of a much larger conflict. Harrison's victory at Tippecanoe was the final unforgivable act that pushed Tecumseh and his shattered Confederacy into a full, desperate alliance with the British in Canada. For months, the war hawks in Washington had been screaming for a fight, and Harrison had just given them the perfect pretext. On June 18, 1812, President James Madison signed the declaration of war. The Tippecanoe War was over. The War of 1812 had begun, and the entire American frontier, now exposed and panicked by the humiliating surrender of Detroit, looked to one man, Old Tippecanoe. For Harrison, the man who had built a legend on a messy, questionable battle, his real war, the one that would test his mettle and cement his heroic image, was just about to begin. On June 18, 1812, President James Madison signed a declaration of war against Great Britain. The reasons were many: the impressment of American sailors, the violation of maritime rights, and, crucially for men like Harrison, the British arming of Native American tribes on the frontier. The American war plan was on paper simple. It was in reality a complete fantasy. The war hawks in Congress believed they could conquer Canada in a matter of weeks. The plan was a three-pronged invasion, one at Niagara, one at Lake Champlain, and one to the far west from Detroit. That western prong was the first to move, and it was the first to be snapped in half. A 60-year-old Revolutionary War veteran, General William Hull, led an army of 2,500 men, mostly untrained Ohio militia, into Detroit. His mission? To invade Canada. But Hull was a man defined by fear. He was terrified of his supply lines, and he was petrified of Tecumseh. The British commander, Isaac Brock, was a military genius, and Tecumseh, now a brigadier general in the British Army, was his key psychological weapon. When Hull crossed into Canada, Tecumseh's warriors staged a series of brilliant, terrifying ambushes that cut Hull's supply lines to ribbons. Hull panicked. He retreated back to the safety of Fort Detroit. Brock and Tecumseh followed. What happened next was, at the time, the single greatest humiliation in American military history. Brock, who was badly outnumbered, staged a brilliant piece of psychological theater. He paraded his 700 Native American warriors, led by Tecumseh, in a long looping circle, past a gap in the woods where the American scouts could see them. The Americans, seeing the same warriors pass by 3 or 4 times, believed they were facing thousands of bloodthirsty savages. Brock then sent Hull a note demanding his surrender. The note politely mentioned that he was unsure if he could control his native allies once the battle began. Hull, looking out from the fort, saw his worst nightmares. He saw a handful of British regulars, a few cannons, and, in his mind, an ocean of warriors screaming for blood. He was responsible not just for his army, but for the hundreds of women and children huddled inside the fort. On August 16, 1812, General William Hull surrendered the entire Michigan Territory, a fort and an army of 2,500 men, without firing a single shot. The news hit the rest of the country like a cannonball. The entire American frontier, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, was now completely undefended. The door had been kicked wide open for a British invasion and for Tecumseh's warriors to reclaim the land Harrison had stolen. Settlers in the Wabash Valley, the very people Harrison had sworn to protect, began to panic and flee east. The nation was in crisis, and it needed a hero. All eyes turned to the one man who had a reputation for fighting these same enemies, William Henry Harrison. But Harrison was a civilian. He was still the governor of Indiana, but his national military career was officially over. The federal government, led by President Madison, and a skeptical Secretary of War, John Eustis, was slow to act. The states, however, were not. The people of Kentucky in particular felt betrayed. Many of their own men had been surrendered at Detroit. In a fit of patriotic fury and democratic zeal, the Kentucky militia gathered. They didn't wait for Washington. They took matters into their own hands. They acclaimed William Henry Harrison, a man who wasn't even from Kentucky, as a major general of the Kentucky militia. It was a stunning, almost unconstitutional move. A state had just created a general and given him an army. President Madison, facing a political firestorm and a military disaster, had no choice. He caved to the popular will. On September 17, 1812, William Henry Harrison was formally commissioned as a major general in the U.S. Army, and given supreme command of the new Army of the Northwest. His orders were simple and nearly impossible: defend the frontier, protect the people, and retake Detroit. Harrison, the 39-year-old governor, was now a general, with an army of nearly 10,000 men on paper and a mandate to save the nation. But his real enemy was not the British. It was the mud. His entire campaign in the winter of 1812 to 1813 was a logistical nightmare. His supply lines ran directly through the great black swamp of northern Ohio. This was a 120-mile wide, 40-mile deep, mosquito-infested primeval bog. Wagons sank up to their axles. Horses, starved and exhausted, died in their harnesses. Men, suffering from dysentery and malaria, deserted in droves, and his army was a temporary illusion. Most were militia, enlisted for just 3 or 6 month terms. Just when he had them trained and marched to the front, their time was up, and they would simply walk home. He was trying to fight a modern war with a frontier rabble across an impassable landscape. The entire winter was a miserable, grinding, frozen hell, and it was about to get so much worse. In January 1813, Harrison had his army split into 2 wings, slowly slogging their way north. A forward detachment of 1,000 men, mostly Kentuckians, was led by General James Winchester. Winchester, an old and vain officer, was jealous of Harrison. Eager for glory, he pushed his men too far, too fast. He reached Frenchtown, a small settlement on the River Raisin, just 26 miles south of Detroit. He easily pushed out a small British guard and liberated the town. He then, criminally, set up his camp in an open, undefended field. The British commander at Detroit, Colonel Henry Proctor, was a vicious and effective officer. He, along with Tecumseh, saw their chance. On the frozen pre-dawn morning of January 22nd, Proctor led a force of 1,100 British regulars and native warriors in a surprise attack. The Americans were routed. After a brief, bloody fight, Winchester was captured. He, like Hull, agreed to surrender his entire force. Proctor, a man in a hurry, was now in a bind. He had 500 American prisoners. He decided to march the able-bodied prisoners back to Fort Malden in Canada immediately through a blizzard. But there were 80-some American soldiers who were too badly wounded to move. Proctor left them behind in Frenchtown, in the civilian homes, under the guard of just a few Canadian militiamen. Tecumseh, who was present, allegedly received Proctor's promise that the wounded would be protected. Proctor and Tecumseh left. The wounded Americans lay in their beds, waiting for sleds to arrive. That night, a group of native warriors who had captured a large store of American whiskey got drunk. They were enraged that Proctor had once again let the Americans surrender. To them, this was not war. This was weakness. On the morning of January 23rd, the warriors returned to Frenchtown. What followed was a massacre. They burst into the houses. They dragged the wounded American soldiers from their beds. They tomahawked them, scalped them, and threw their bodies into the burning houses. The snow of the peaceful settlement was stained dark red. The news of the River Raisin massacre was a new, profound national trauma. It was a war crime, and it completely changed the psychology of the war. For William Henry Harrison, it was a devastating military and personal blow, but he was, as ever, a brilliant political operator. He knew that fear and rage were the world's best recruiting tools. He and the press seized on the story. The war was no longer an abstract invasion of Canada. It was a blood feud. It was a war of revenge. A new battle cry was born. It was shouted by new recruits from Kentucky to Ohio. It was painted on the standards of Harrison's army. Remember the raisin. Harrison's army now had a soul, but Harrison the general had learned a hard lesson. He would not advance again until he had solved the one problem, that had plagued him from the start, his supply line. And he realized the only way to do that was to control the water. Harrison's new strategy was one of active defense. He would not advance. He built a new massive and brilliantly engineered fortress in the middle of the Black Swamp on the Maumee River. He named it Fort Meigs. This fort was his anchor. From here he could wait. He knew he could never retake Detroit as long as the British controlled Lake Erie. The lake was a blue highway for the British. They could move men, cannons, and food with ease. Harrison, meanwhile, was stuck in the mud. The war on the frontier for the next 6 months became a stalemate. In May 1813, Proctor and Tecumseh led a force of 2,000 men to besiege Fort Meigs. They shelled the fort for a week. Harrison, dug in and well supplied, held them off. The siege was a bloody failure for the British, but Harrison still couldn't advance. The entire war for the Northwest now rested not on Harrison's 10,000 men, but on a 27-year-old naval officer named Oliver Hazard Perry. Perry had been given an impossible task: build a fleet. On the shores of Presque Isle, Pennsylvania, using timber cut from the green surrounding forest, Perry's men, in a matter of months, built an entire 9-ship squadron. It was a staggering feat of logistics and will. By September, the American fleet was on the water, looking for the British. On September 10th, 1813, they found them. The Battle of Lake Erie is one of the most dramatic duels in naval history. Harrison was not there. He was 50 miles away at his camp, listening to the distant thunder of the cannons. Perry's flagship, the Lawrence, sailed directly at the British fleet. It was pounded by long-range British cannons. Within 2 hours, the Lawrence was a floating wreck. 80% of its crew was killed or wounded, but Perry was not Hull. He was not Winchester. He grabbed his battle flag, a large blue banner with the simple dying words of his friend Captain James Lawrence: "Don't give up the ship." He and a handful of men lowered a rowboat into the middle of the battle. As cannonballs splashed around them, they rowed through the smoke, across a quarter-mile of open water, to his second-largest ship, the Niagara. He climbed aboard, hoisted his flag, and seizing command, did the unthinkable. He sailed the Niagara not away from the British, but directly at them. He broke their battle line, firing devastating close-range broadsides from both sides of his ship. In 15 minutes, the battle was over. The entire British fleet, for the first time in history, had surrendered. Perry, using the back of an old envelope, scribbled a note. A small boat carried it to the shore, where a rider was waiting. The rider galloped 50 miles to Harrison's camp. The general, surrounded by his anxious officers, broke the seal. The note read, "Dear General, we have met the enemy, and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop. Yours with great respect, O. H. Perry." The entire strategic map had been redrawn. Harrison's mud problem was over. The Blue Highway was his. The British supply line was cut. In Detroit, Colonel Proctor heard the news and he panicked. He knew he couldn't hold Detroit. He couldn't hold Canada. He couldn't even feed his men. He ordered a full, immediate, and desperate retreat. This was the moment William Henry Harrison had been waiting for. He loaded 3,500 of his men, including 1,500 vengeful Kentucky cavalry, onto Perry's captured ships. He sailed across the lake unopposed. He landed in Canada. He marched to Fort Malden. It was abandoned and burning. He marched to Detroit. It was abandoned. The citizens, his own people, ran into the streets to cheer him as a liberator. He had retaken Detroit without firing a shot. But Harrison wasn't done. He would not make Hull's mistake. He was going to destroy the British Army. He left a garrison at Detroit and with 3,500 men began a relentless, high-speed pursuit of Proctor's fleeing, demoralized force. Tecumseh was disgusted. His alliance with the British had been a disaster. He and his 1,000 warriors, along with their wives and children, were now being dragged along in a panicked, undignified retreat. He rode to Proctor and in front of the British officers famously denounced him. He called Proctor a fat dog who puts his tail between his legs and runs. He promised to stand and fight with or without the British. On October 5, 1813, Proctor was finally forced to make a stand. His back was to the Thames River in Ontario, Canada. The battlefield was a muddy tract of land. Proctor, in a final act of tactical incompetence, placed his 800 British regulars in a loose, thin line and put his best troops, Tecumseh's 1,000 warriors, in a dense, tangled swamp on his right flank. Harrison's army arrived. He surveyed the field. He saw the weak British line. His textbook mad Anthony Wayne training told him to dismount his men and begin a slow, grinding infantry battle. But his Kentucky militia officers, particularly a fire-breathing politician named Richard Mentor Johnson, had a different, crazier idea. They wanted to charge on horseback. Harrison, in a moment of pure tactical brilliance, agreed. He ordered his 1,500 Kentucky mounted riflemen to form up. It was an unorthodox, almost suicidal plan. The bugles sounded. The Kentuckians screamed their battle cry, "Remember the Raisin!" The entire force charged. The British regulars, already defeated in their minds, watched in horror as a tidal wave of 1,500 screaming frontiersmen on horseback bore down on them. They fired one ragged, panicked volley, and then they broke. They threw down their guns. They surrendered. The entire British left and center collapsed in less than 10 minutes. General Proctor, the man responsible for the Raisin, ignominiously fled the battlefield in his carriage. But the battle was not over. On the right, in the swamp, Tecumseh and his warriors did not run. Here, the real brutal fight began. The 2nd Battalion of Kentuckians, led by Richard Mentor Johnson himself, charged into the swamp. The warriors, hidden behind trees, unleashed a devastating volley. The forlorn hope charge was broken. It became a desperate hand-to-hand fight in the mud and water. In the chaos, Richard Mentor Johnson shot 5 times, allegedly saw a chief painted and defiant charging him. Johnson pulled his pistol and shot the chief dead. Moments later, a cry went up from the warriors, "Tecumseh is dead." The word spread through the swamp like a shock wave. Tecumseh, the prophet's brother, the statesman, the warrior, the soul of the pan-Indian Confederacy, was dead. The resistance, which had lasted a generation, did not fade. It evaporated. The warriors, now leaderless, simply vanished into the forest. The Battle of the Thames was a total, crushing, and decisive American victory. Harrison had not just defeated an army, he had killed a dream. The Native American alliance was permanently broken. The war in the Northwest was, effectively, over. William Henry Harrison was, now and forever, a national hero. He was the Washington of the West. He was the man who had avenged Detroit, the man who had avenged the Raisin, the man who had at last solved the Indian problem. Harrison's glory was immediate, but it was also fleeting. He quickly clashed with his boss, the new Secretary of War, John Armstrong. Armstrong was a jealous, petty, and ambitious man who saw Harrison as a political rival. He began to bypass Harrison, issuing orders directly to his subordinates. He carved up Harrison's command. Harrison, the proud Virginia aristocrat, the hero of the Thames, would not stand for such an insult. In May 1814, with the war still raging on other fronts, William Henry Harrison did the unthinkable. He resigned his commission. He chose his personal pride over his national duty. He abandoned his post in a fit of aristocratic pique. But his legend was so large, his victory so total, that he paid no political price. Congress, ignoring his resignation, awarded him a gold medal for his services. He returned to his farm in North Bend, Ohio, as the most famous soldier in America. And then, for the next 25 years, nothing. This is the wilderness portion of Harrison's life, the part the 1840 campaign would conveniently forget. He was a hero, but he was also a terrible businessman. His farm was failing. A whiskey distillery he had built, a deep irony given what was to come, was a financial failure. His land speculations, the ones he'd been making since 1798, had gone bad. He was drowning in debt. He was a hero, but he was broke. He spent the next 2.5 decades desperately trying to cash in on his fame, taking whatever job he could get to pay his creditors. From 1816 to 1819, he served as a U.S. congressman from Ohio. He was, by all accounts, an undistinguished, mediocre legislator. His most notable act was a passionate defense of his old Army colleague, Andrew Jackson, for illegally invading Spanish Florida. From 1819 to 1821, he took a step down, serving in the Ohio State Senate. In 1825, he managed to get back to Washington, serving a term as a U.S. Senator. He was a reliable but bland pro-West vote. He chaired the Committee on Military Affairs, a respectable but not powerful post. His great prize came in 1828, when President John Quincy Adams appointed him U.S. Minister to Gran Colombia. This was his chance at international prestige. He was a total disaster. He arrived in Bogota and found the new republic, led by the great liberator Simón Bolívar, in a state of crisis. Harrison, instead of acting as a diplomat, acted as a preachy, arrogant lecturer. He openly sided with Bolívar's political enemies. He then wrote Bolívar a long, pompous, and deeply insulting letter, lecturing him on the dangers of tyranny and comparing him to a Roman despot. When Harrison's old enemy Andrew Jackson became president in 1829, his first act was to recall Harrison in disgrace. By 1830, William Henry Harrison was 57 years old. His military career was over. His political career was over. His diplomatic career was a joke. He was a national hero, but a personal and professional failure. He was so broke, so deeply in debt, that he had to beg for and accept a humiliating job: clerk of courts for Hamilton County, Ohio. Imagine this. This is the Washington of the West, the son of a signer of the Declaration, the man born at Berkeley Plantation, the hero who retook Detroit, and he is now spending his old age in a dusty provincial courthouse, stamping dockets and filing papers for a modest salary, just to keep the bank from seizing his farm. It was a profound and deeply human fall from grace. He was, by all rights, a man of the past, a relic. In 1836, a new disorganized political party called the Whigs, a loose coalition of anyone who hated King Andrew Jackson, was looking for a candidate. They couldn't agree on one, so they ran 3 regional candidates, hoping to split the vote. As their Western candidate, they dusted off the old general, Old Tippecanoe. He was a safe, inoffensive name with a heroic past. Harrison ran, and he lost to Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren. But he did surprisingly well. He won 7 states. He proved he still had that one magical thing: name recognition. The Whig Party's political bosses, men like Thaddeus Stevens and the great Henry Clay, took notice. They lost in 1836, but 1840 was coming, and the country was about to fall into a massive economic depression. They knew Martin Van Buren would be vulnerable. They knew they could win, but their main candidate, the brilliant, arrogant Henry Clay, was too political. He had too many enemies. They needed a hero, a blank slate, a man with a great story and no political record to attack. They needed a Cincinnatus, A man called from his plow or his dusty clerk's desk to save the Republic. In 1839, the Whig bosses looked at this 67-year-old debt-ridden failed diplomat, and they got a brilliant, cynical, and revolutionary idea. They realized they could sell him. They could take this Virginia aristocrat, this failed speculator, this courthouse clerk, and, with a little marketing, they could reinvent him. They could turn him into the opposite of everything he truly was. The long, quiet wilderness years were over. The stage was being set for the first and most fraudulent political campaign in American history. This brilliant, cynical idea would change American politics forever. The Whig Party bosses, desperate to defeat the Jacksonian Democrats in the upcoming 1840 election, saw in Harrison the perfect political weapon, a man with a heroic past and no political present. He was a blank slate. At the Whig National Convention in December 1839, the party bosses sidelined Henry Clay and, in a stunning upset, nominated the 67-year-old Old Tippecanoe. It was less a statesman's victory than a carefully staged battle of image over substance. In a stunning upset, they nominated the old general. Harrison was their man. John Tyler, a pro-slavery Virginian, who was ironically a supporter of Henry Clay, was added to the ticket to balance it. The Tippecanoe and Tyler II ticket was born. The Democrats, who were renominating Martin Van Buren, were ecstatic. They saw Harrison as a joke. They saw him as General Mum, a washed-up, senile old man who had no platform. A Democratic newspaper, the Baltimore Republican, decided to mock him. And in doing so, they accidentally wrote the most important political phrase of the 19th century. Trying to paint Harrison as a pathetic, out-of-touch relic, a journalist wrote, "Give him a barrel of hard cider and a pension of $2,000 a year, and he will sit the remainder of his days in his log cabin." It was meant as a devastating insult. It was meant to portray him as a simple, backwoods drunkard. A Whig operative named Nicholas Biddle, a wealthy Philadelphia banker, read that line and had a eureka moment. He circulated the memo. "Don't fight it," he said, "use it." He realized that the Democrats had just handed them the entire campaign gift-wrapped. The country was in the middle of a horrible depression. The people were poor, angry, and distrustful of Washington. Their sitting president, Martin Van Buren, was a New York dandy, a man who had come from humble origins, but now lived, they claimed, like a king. He was Martin Van Ruin. He allegedly ate off gold plates in the White House palace and scented his whiskers with French cologne. The Whigs now had their perfect contrast. It wasn't going to be about the national bank. It wasn't going to be about the tariff. It was going to be a simple, powerful, and completely fraudulent story. The aristocrat in the palace versus the common man in the log cabin. The 1840 campaign began, and it was, in every sense, the birth of modern American politics. It was the first time in history that a political party and a candidate sold an image instead of a policy. First, they sold the man, William Henry Harrison, the son of a governor, the man born at Berkeley Plantation, the man living in a 16-room mansion on the Ohio River, was reintroduced to America as the log cabin candidate. Whig propaganda was relentless. They published fake biographies, complete with woodcut illustrations, depicting a humble Harrison being born in a rustic frontier cabin. They called him the farmer of North Bend, a simple man of the soil. This in itself was an insult to real farmers. Harrison's farm was, by all accounts, horribly managed and a financial failure. They called him the cider-sipping hero, a man who, unlike the wine-drinking Van Buren, was a friend of the common man. This was a double stroke of genius. It not only made him relatable, it inoculated him from charges of being a drunk. A common attack at the time. The deep, dark irony, of course, was that Harrison was a commercial whiskey distiller and had built his entire governorship on the use of whiskey to sign fraudulent treaties, but history didn't matter. Second, they sold the brand. This was the first branded campaign. They invented the modern slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, was the catchy, meaningless, and immortal phrase that swept the nation. They had dozens of others. Van is a used-up man. Old Tip, the farmer's friend. They invented political merchandise. The Whigs, a party of bankers and industrialists, put their factories to work. They produced Tippecanoe handkerchiefs, Tippecanoe teacups, Tippecanoe songbooks. They made log cabin-shaped perfume bottles for women and log cabin-shaped whiskey bottles for men, sold as Old North Bend or Tippecanoe whiskey. They invented the mass political rally. Before 1840, politics was a somber local affair. The Whigs turned it into a national carnival. They held enormous outdoor festivals. They staged massive barbecues, roasting whole oxen and handing out free hard cider, often in log cabin-shaped barrels. They built actual log cabins in town squares, set them on wagons, and pulled them in enormous mile-long parades. They constructed 10-foot-high paper and tin spheres, painted with slogans, and rolled them from town to town, from city to city, in a massive display of grassroots energy. This is where we get the American phrase, keep the ball rolling. Tens of thousands, sometimes 100,000 people would gather in a single field, like the rally at Dayton, Ohio, to sing songs, drink cider, and celebrate their hero. It was all pure, unadulterated political theater. What, you ask, was Harrison's platform? What was his policy on the economic crisis? On the national bank? On the tariff? The Whigs had a brilliant answer: silence. They refused to publish a platform. They knew it would only divide them. The entire message was Van Buren equals bad, Harrison equals good. The Democrats were baffled. They were trying to have a policy debate, and the Whigs were having a party. They correctly pointed out that Harrison was, in fact, a wealthy aristocrat. They called him General Mum because he refused to speak on the issues. It didn't matter. The truth was irrelevant. The story was better. Harrison himself was kept largely quiet on his farm in North Bend. He was packaged as the Cincinnatus of the West, the humble hero, who, like the Roman general, would leave his plow to save the Republic. In November 1840, the nation voted. The turnout was a staggering 80%, a record that stood for over a century. The log cabin and hard cider campaign was not just a success, it was a revolution. William Henry Harrison, the 67-year-old clerk, had won in a landslide. The fraud had worked. The hero was at last going to the White House. On March 4th, 1841, Washington, D.C. was a sea of Whig supporters celebrating in the streets. This was their moment, and it was Harrison's. The day was bitter. It was cold, gray, and wet with a freezing wind. William Henry Harrison, now 68 years old, was about to give his final and most fatal performance. He was the oldest man yet elected president. He had been sold as the tough-as-nails frontier hero. He had to look the part. He refused a carriage. He rode a magnificent white charger, Old Whitey, in the inaugural parade. And as he stood before the crowd on the east portico of the Capitol, he refused to wear an overcoat, gloves, or a hat. This was his last act of political theater. He was Old Tippecanoe, the man who had slept in the snow. He would not be beaten by a little wind. And then he began his speech. If the campaign was a populist triumph, the speech was an aristocratic bore. It was as if the real Harrison, the classically educated Latin-spouting Virginia gentleman, had returned. It was 8,445 words. It took him 1 hour and 45 minutes to read, his voice growing hoarse in the freezing wind. It was a dense, academic, and baffling text. He did not speak of the common man or log cabins or hard cider. Instead, he delivered a long, pedantic lecture on the dangers of executive power, with endless references to the Roman Republic. He quoted Roman proconsuls. He name-dropped the Caesars. He was, in effect, the college student from Hampton, Sydney, finally delivering his thesis. The crowd stood freezing as he droned on. In that speech, he made one crucial, fatal promise. He, as a Whig, believed the president should be weak. He pledged to be a one-term president. He pledged to be subservient to Congress. He pledged to never veto a bill unless it was unconstitutional. He was, in short, promising to be the figurehead the Whig bosses had hired. But the old general had one last fight in him. The real leader of the Whig Party, Henry Clay, assumed he would be running the country. He arrived in Washington intending to be the power behind the throne. He strode into the White House, sat down with Harrison, and handed him a list of who he, Henry Clay, had chosen for the cabinet. Harrison, the old soldier, the man who had resigned his commission rather than be insulted by the Secretary of War, was furious. According to the reports, the 68-year-old president stood up and, in a rage, snapped at the most powerful man in the Senate. "Mr. Clay, you forget that I am the president." He rejected Clay's list. He chose his own cabinet, led by Clay's great rival, Daniel Webster. It was a stunning act of independence. But this, combined with his speech, set the stage for a disastrously brief presidency. He had in a single day declared war on his own party's leader and simultaneously pledged to be a weak executive. Worse, he was a victim of his own victory. The spoils system, which Andrew Jackson had perfected, meant that his entire 80% voter turnout now felt they deserved a job. The White House was, for 31 days, under a literal siege. Harrison was mobbed 24/7 by a horde of office seekers. They waited in the hallways. They sat in his dining room. They grabbed him as he tried to take a walk. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. He couldn't govern. He complained to a friend, "I am so much harassed by the multitude that I can give no proper attention to any business of my own." He was 68 years old. He was exhausted. He was underslept. And his immune system was collapsing. On March 26, 1841, just 3 weeks after his speech, President Harrison went for an early morning walk. He was caught in a sudden cold downpour. He returned to the White House soaked. That afternoon, he developed a chill. This is where the myth begins. The myth is that he caught a cold at his inauguration, that it turned into pneumonia, and that he died from his own pride. It's a perfect, tragic, simple story, and it is almost entirely false. The real story, as pieced together by a 2014 medical analysis, is far stranger, more modern, and more disgusting. His illness did begin with a cold, but it didn't become a simple pneumonia. It became a raging fever, violent shivering, and this is the key: severe, debilitating gastrointestinal distress. He had agonizing abdominal pain and relentless diarrhea. This was not pneumonia. This was enteric fever, typhoid. He had, in modern terms, a massive systemic bacterial infection. He was dying of septic shock. The question then is, where did he get it? The answer is as ironic as his entire fabricated life. He got it from the White House water. In 1841, Washington, D.C. was not a shining capital. It was a primitive, muddy provincial town. It had no sewer system. The White House, the palace that Harrison had conquered from Van Buren, got its water from a spring that was located just 7 blocks upstream from a night soil depository. A night soil depository is a 19th century euphemism for a public sewage dump. The raw human waste of the city was being dumped into a marsh, which was then leaching directly into the water supply of the President of the United States. William Henry Harrison, the log cabin hero, the hard cider candidate, was not killed by his own macho pride. He was killed by a lack of basic urban sanitation. He was killed by a glass of contaminated water. His final days were a special kind of hell. As he lay in the White House delirious with fever, his doctors, the best in the nation, assembled, and they proceeded to torture him to death. They, like his old mentor Benjamin Rush, were believers in heroic medicine. They saw the fever and believed his body was overexcited. They bled him, using hot cups to draw blood and leeches. They were draining the blood from a man who was already in septic shock. They forced him to swallow ipecac and calomel, a mercury-based compound, to induce violent vomiting and more diarrhea. They gave him crude opium. They gave him snake weed. They blistered his skin. For 9 days, they and the disease ravaged his body. He grew more and more delirious. On the night of April 3rd, he was heard to mutter his last confused but poignant words. He was speaking, he thought, not to his doctor, but to his vice president, John Tyler. "Sir," he whispered, "I wish you to understand the true principles of the government. I wish them carried out. I ask nothing more." At 12:30 a.m. on April 4th, 1841, 31 days after taking the oath of office, William Henry Harrison was dead. His wife Anna, whom he had eloped with 45 years earlier, was still in Ohio. She had been too ill to travel and was in the middle of packing her bags to join him in Washington. She never set foot in the White House as First Lady. The nation was thrown into a state of shock, grief, and total constitutional chaos. A president had never died in office. No one knew what to do. The problem was the Constitution itself. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6, was famously and dangerously vague. It reads, "In case of the removal of the president from office, or of his death, resignation, or inability, the same shall devolve on the vice president." The same. What did the same mean? Did it mean the office of president devolved? Did John Tyler become the president? Or did it just mean the powers and duties of the office devolved? Was Tyler still the vice president, merely acting as president? It was a profound and terrifying question. The fate of the executive branch hung in the balance. Harrison's cabinet, led by the powerful Daniel Webster, believed in the acting theory. They gathered and sent a formal letter to John Tyler, who was at his home in Virginia. They addressed it pointedly to the Vice President of the United States. John Tyler received the letter. He read it, and he made a decision that would set the course of American history. Tyler was not Harrison. He was not a figurehead. He was a rigid, aristocratic, pro-slavery ideologue. He had been put on the ticket only to get votes. He was Tippecanoe's afterthought, but he was not going to be Mr. Acting President. He returned the cabinet's letter, unopened. He raced to Washington. He strode into the hotel where the cabinet was meeting, and he informed them, in no uncertain terms, that he was the president. To settle the matter, he had a federal judge administer the full presidential oath of office. He moved his family into the White House, and he issued a formal address to the nation, declaring that he, John Tyler, had been called to the executive. His enemies were furious. They called him his accidency. They mocked him as the accidental president. But they were powerless. He had seized the office. This was the Tyler precedent. It was a precedent of unbroken, stable, and immediate succession that stood for 126 years, until it was finally formally codified as the 25th Amendment in 1967. This is William Henry Harrison's most powerful and most accidental legacy. His 31-day presidency and his tragic, filthy death forced the country to solve the question of succession. His greatest act was not in living, but in dying. So who was William Henry Harrison? Was he the hero, or was he the fraud? He was in the end both. He was a man of staggering, almost perfectly American contradictions. He was the aristocrat born on a slave plantation who became the icon of the common man. He was the Indian hater, the land jobber, the governor who built a career on 13 fraudulent treaties, fueled by whiskey and political division. And he was also General Harrison, a brave, disciplined, and brilliant commander who at the Battle of the Thames won a legitimate, total, and strategically vital victory for his country.